coming up on Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic.
My son, when he was 9, I remember him looking at me and he just said, if Daddy loves us so much, then why does he drink so much? And I just looked at him and I said, look, buddy, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know how to explain that to you. I wonder the same thing. But I do know he does love us.
Plus,
I'm a doctor. I take care of people who have addiction. I couldn't fix or solve my husband's problem. I couldn't cure that for him. And if a doctor can't do it, nobody can. It has to come from the person with the addiction.
All that and more on this episode.
Life Audio.
Hello, and welcome to the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. I am your host, John Seidel, and I am the Christian who became an alcoholic, not the other way around. Here, we get radically vulnerable about addiction, recovery, messy sanctification, and all the things we turn to instead of Jesus because we're all addicted to something. You'll hear raw, honest conversations from those who have struggled, those who help those who struggle, and why aiming for Jesus and getting sobriety thrown in is actually the best goal. So, let's get right into this week's episode. There's a chapter in my book that I never wrote. I don't mean that it was, written by some ghostwriter. What I mean is there was a chapter that I was originally supposed to write. And when I got to the point where I sat down to write it, I couldn't write it. And that chapter was supposed to be, or what was going to be, advice for friends, family members, loved ones of those struggling with addiction. Because in my first book, Finding Rest on Faith and Mental Health, I had wrote a chapter for loved ones and family members, kind of just offering some tips and advice on how to handle it, right? And what to do and what to say and what not to say. And it was like a runaway success. And people would reach out to me, or I'd meet them and they'd say, "Man, that chapter was so helpful for me." And I thought, okay, well, I'll duplicate that for this next book, for Confessions. But when I sat down to write it, I just realized, not that mental health is necessarily one size fits all, but addiction especially isn't one size fits all. And while there were some universal, principles and ideas that I felt comfortable conveying regarding mental health, I just realized, I can't do that for this. Because there are just too many variables. I say that because today's guest, I think, is what I hoped for and envisioned when I wasn't able to write that chapter. Today's guest is the wife of someone who battled addiction, alcoholism in particular, and that person lost the battle. And so Brenda Fann Katula reached out to me after listening to this podcast regularly and said, "Hey, I would love to come share my story and encourage loved ones and family members from the perspective of someone who has been there, who has been gaslit, who has tried to protect her kids and her family, who has done the interventions, who has gotten church involved, who has done anything and everything." And I want to let them know my experience and maybe offer some encouragement and thoughts. And I thought, yep, that's what I want, right? I couldn't write the chapter, but I can have guests and interview people like Brenda. And so I know that there are plenty of people out there who are friends and family and loved ones who need encouragement, and this episode will give it to you. So Brenda today is going to share her story. Now, because this is the longest episode we've ever recorded, rather than cut it down or make it hard to listen to in one sitting, I have decided to do a first in Confessions history, and that is I'm splitting this up into part 1 and part 2. And so this will be part 1. Part 2 will be the next episode, which if you're, in a sense, following along live, that will be next week. Or if you're just binging this, then you can just go on to part 2 right after this one. In the first episode, we are going to talk about Brenda's husband's drinking problem, like how she came to realize it, how it progressed, the warning signs, the extraordinary steps that she took to protect her children, which is really important. And we'll also talk about what she wishes she had done differently, which is an interesting conversation. And then how she, as a physician who treats people and recognizes the signs of alcohol addiction, how even she couldn't make it all stop. And I think that's a really important conversation because I talk to a lot of people, a lot of spouses who want sobriety, who want, in a sense, the full life that Jesus offers. They want it more for their spouse than their spouse does. And so what do you do when that's the case? The second episode, we'll talk about the intervention that she staged, how that landed her husband in the hospital. There's a cornfield story that is really interesting. The lengths that she had to go to keep him from driving their children. I mean, my goodness, reaching out to the daycare and that conversation. We'll talk about her anger towards God in part 2, and then what she learned about prayer, forgiveness, and finding hope after addiction. And that is despite the way that her husband's story ended with his death. I'm really encouraged by this conversation. I think you will be too. I don't want to belabor the point. I want to get right into it with Brenda Fann Katula. She is a medical doctor, a practicing physician. She has her MBA. And she is now going back for her master's in biblical and theological studies. And so she brings this kind of triple threat perspective, right? From a medical perspective, from a wife's perspective, and then from a biblical perspective. And I just can't say enough how important and beneficial this conversation is. So without further ado, Brenda Fann Katula. Brenda, thank you so much for joining the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. This is really, I think it's going to be a really important episode, and you have been good. You know, I tell people all the time, if you think you have a story, go to christianalcoholic.com, fill out the form, reach out to me. You did that, and you've been persistent in a good way about talking about your story. And I'm so glad to have you on today. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I said, I talked a little bit about you in the intro, but one of the things that I think is so crucial for today's conversation, we were talking a little offline before, but you kind of bring this triumvirate of a perspective, right? Mm-hmm. As a medical doctor, as the wife of someone who struggled, and then as a Christian. And so I'm really looking forward to talking about all three of those things. But why don't you I love letting people introduce themselves, because I think they pick out, what they think is the most interesting part. So why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. That's the dreaded interview question, right?
Yeah, right.
Tell me about yourself. So my name's Brenda Fann Katula, and I am, as you said, a physician. I'm a family physician. I'm a mom. I have 2 wonderful children and 3 stepchildren. I'm married to a wonderful man, and I am a Bible study teacher, writer, leader, and I'm a student. I'm getting my master's in biblical and theological studies. I have chickens. I love to garden. I love dark chocolate. I love lattes, being outside. I do not like ticks or mosquitoes.
Yeah.
There you go.
And you're in that kind of northern Illinois area where mosquitoes are kind of the state bird in summer.
Yes, they are. But we also have winter. So I love winter, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, as someone who grew up and is from Wisconsin, I can say that I don't like winter. I was tired of it. And so I fled down to Texas, where now, on certain Christmases, it's 80 degrees. And I'm always pointing that out to my family, who is still in Wisconsin. They're actually coming to visit in a few weeks. So
we send our sympathies that you have no snow.
Yeah. Yeah. When it's 105 in July, then I'm like, okay, I'll take some snow. And I'm curious, Brenda, how did you start listening to the podcast? Like, how did you find us?
Sure. So someone had suggested to me that I start listening to podcasts, and I just basically searched Christian alcohol, Christian addiction, and I came across yours, and your title just got me, Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic. And I listened to your first one in your story and then several of your interviews, and that's how I found you.
And I would say in some ways you are a student of the podcast because, as you pointed out, you're like, when you reached out, you're like, hey, it doesn't sound like you have a lot of perspective necessarily from family members. And I said, you are exactly right. And so many that listen to this podcast and read what I write and whatnot are people who love people who struggle. And, you have this story of loving someone for a while who struggled with alcoholism and eventually lost that battle. And I know there's at least one other person right now, because that person has emailed me, who has a very similar story. And in fact, she just lost her husband in, I believe, December.
I'm sorry.
To alcoholism. And so I know how important it is for you to be on the show today. So why don't you just kind of take us back and tell us your story? Tell us about your husband. Tell us when you started noticing it, and then, we'll kind of dig into some of the other aspects of that. We'll be right back after this.
So, we got married, and he drank then when we were dating. And one of the things I noticed was I would buy a bottle of rum, so that when he would come over, if he wanted a drink, he could have a drink. And one of the things I noticed was that handle of rum, which I thought would last weeks or months, was on in the weekend. And I think if I'm being honest, I shouldn't say probably, I'm still hedging, right? If I'm being totally honest, I suspected that he had a problem back then. And the one thing I do want to say before I go into the story is, he was a good man. He was a kind man. I loved him for a reason. He had an awful disease, and that disease just ate away at all of those good parts of him. So as I'm telling the story, I just wanted to be clear. I'm not saying bad things about him. It's the disease that's bad. And I just want to make sure there's that distinction. So we got married, and within 2 years, we had our daughter. And then a couple of years later, we had our son. And quite quickly, the drinking escalated. I didn't realize how much trauma and PTSD he had been carrying. And I also didn't realize the extent of undiagnosed depression and anxiety that he had. So when he was 10 years old, his family was in a single car accident on a sunny August day. His mom, dad, older sister in the front seat of the car all died. He was the oldest surviving sibling. He had a younger sister and a younger brother. In the back seat, they survived. And another couple was in the back seat. This is in the 70s when you had those giant cars, so you fit all these people in there. Right. And it was a single car accident. It went off the road and hit the tree. And, immediately his entire life has changed, right? I mean, he's lost his home, he's lost his family, he's lost everything. And he and his siblings went to live at an orphanage called Mooseheart, where back in the day then, boys his age lived in one home. His sister lived in a different home with girls her age, and then his younger brother was in a home for 4-year-olds at that time. And they went to school there on that campus. And they learned skills, and they graduated high school. But the minute they graduated, they were expected to leave, and that was it.
Yeah.
Both of their parents were only children, so there was, no aunts and uncles to take them in. So the first year we were married and the anniversary of that accident came around, I realized he really has some unresolved depression and trauma from this. And he would lay on the couch for days around the time of this accident each year. And gradually his drinking escalated and escalated. And I'll spare you the gory details, but suffice it to say, the police in our town knew us very well. The sheriff was out at our house more than once. I'll tell you a story about the restraining order in a moment, but I had a restraining order, 30-day inpatient rehabs, refusing to go to counseling or AA because those things didn't work, and the counselors were, didn't know what they were talking about. And I think it was just all an excuse to avoid that discomfort that comes with getting treatment. Yeah. Lots of hospital visits, blood alcohol levels that continued to escalate. At one point, his blood alcohol level was 0.4.
Oh, my
and
goodness.
For those, yes. And so a 0.4, for those of you who don't understand blood alcohol level percentages, at that level, that's a life-threatening level. 50% of people are either comatose or in respiratory depression. And with the 0.4, he was still talking and walking. So this just tells you the incredible amount of tolerance and how much he was drinking.
And what did that look like? How much was he drinking?
The big handles of a bottle of rum, easily one a day, if not more. I don't think I realized exactly how much he was drinking. I could tell with credit card receipts that he would alternate liquor stores. And I think because he didn't want to see him coming in so often, so he would go like a cycle of 2 or 3 different ones that he would rotate through. When he passed away, I found these large empty rum bottles, construction-sized garbage bags full of them, and large garbage cans full of them hidden up in our barn. So there was, he just couldn't put them all in recycling without me noticing. So he was kind of storing them in other places, and it was months and months and months of finding hidden bottles in the basement, the garage, the barn, after he had passed. But he had withdrawal symptoms, pretty bad. He would, start to get sweaty, hallucinate, all of those things, the tremors. At one point I said, you really have to go into the hospital because you're going to seize if you don't get some treatment now for the withdrawal. And he refused to go. He did not seize. I don't know how he didn't have a seizure from that. He did have an ICU stay where he went in for detox, and things escalated, and he ended up in the intensive care unit on a ventilator. They had to sedate him, with some serious IV medicines to prevent him from seizing because he was so, having such bad withdrawal. So we had a lot of struggles. There were a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, through all of that. But ultimately, he continued to lose a lot of weight. All he was doing was drinking, and he wasn't really eating. So he got down. He's a 6'2" guy, probably 210, 220 when I met him. Robust guy. And by this time, if he weighed 130, I would have been shocked.
Wow.
He was just really, really thin. And then January of that year, my daughter had said, I don't think Daddy's going to be here at Christmas. And, she's 13 at the time. And I said, I don't think he is either. And he passed away over that Memorial Day weekend. Our son was 10. Our daughter was 13. Sorry. I still get a little choked up.
Yeah.
It's something you never expect that you have to tell your children. So that's, in a nutshell, our story.
Did his body just shut down?
No, he actually, I've kept the details of his death private, just for my children.
Yeah.
But it was not suicide. I will tell you that. It was definitely not suicide, and it was related to his drinking.
Yeah.
It was absolutely related to that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that overview. I know, I've lost a stepdad, I've lost a sister, and, you know, and to things that in a sense weren't, if you will, preventable to a degree. And that's hard. And I'm sure there continues to be emotion around that for me. And so I can only imagine for you.
I'm sorry for your loss.
Well, and it's, you know, it's interesting because part of my story is that, you know, my sister who I lost, I say I didn't lose her to drugs directly, although she was an addict, but she was living a lifestyle, right, that was just hard, right? And so she was killed in a car accident that wasn't her fault, but yet it was like, you know, she was coming back from the junkyard because, again, she didn't have any money because she would spend it on drugs. So now she's scraping together parts for her car, and it's like, it's just this hard, you know, this hard life. So I want to go back. I think, you know, when you look, when did you first start realizing, okay, this seems to really be a problem, and what did that look like?
Sure. So there were a couple turning points where I realized this is just crazy. There's a bad problem. I think the physician side of me, you know, the very rational, practical, able to diagnose things, that side of me, I think, recognized what was going on. The wife side of me didn't want that to be. There was some denial there, I think, on my part too. And I just couldn't reconcile what was going on. And I think at the same time, it was just this constant battle in my brain between seeing what was happening and dealing with it. And there was one day, one of my turning points, there were three main turning points for me where I realized it was a bad problem. One was I had left for work, and I wear glasses, but my prescription's so minimal, and I actually forgot my glasses and forgot to put contacts in. So I get about halfway to work, and I realized, oh, darn it, I got to turn around and go back. And I dropped the kids off to daycare, started to head to work. Now I got to turn around and go back, and he was supposed to be at work. He was a self-employed carpenter remodeler. And I walk in the house, and he is sitting on the couch with this giant rum and Coke. And it's about 8 a.m. And I just about lost it because, you know, I'm angry I have to go to work. I'm angry I'm now having to work full time because, you know, he's not bringing in much money. And now I realize why, because he's not drinking. I mean, because he's not working. I realize he's drinking at 8 a.m. because he has to. The only way for him to keep the withdrawal away is if he continually drinks. And I hadn't realized before that he was drinking throughout the day and starting his day off with a drink. So that was when I realized there's a bad problem here. The second time, well, I should say not the second time I realized, but more confirmation that we really had a problem was when he said he wasn't going to drink anymore at all. And the continual promises, I'm not going to drink, I'm done. And a neighbor of ours was having a Halloween party, and she had said the kids could all come up until like 6 o'clock, and then it was going to be adults only. So we went over with the kids and, you know, had a nice time. But, you know, they were making drinks, and he started right away. And I thought, you said you weren't drinking anymore. And when it was time for the kids to leave, you know, the kids and I went home, and he decided to stay. And, you know, I'm sitting on the couch, and it's 10 p.m., 10:30, 11. And I'm waiting for him because I don't want to lock the door because he doesn't have his keys. And then at some point, I just realized this is not my problem anymore. You know, I'm tired. I'm going to bed. I'm locking the door, and I'm going to bed. And that fact that I decided to not save or rescue him from not having keys, not being home, I think was a turning point in my mind to realize you just can't keep doing this. And the final turning point for me was we needed to get a restraining order. And I will preface this by saying if my kids and I were in serious physical danger or harm, we wouldn't have stayed. So I don't want it to sound like that. But there was a reason for a restraining order. And it was New Year's Eve. no attorney's offices are open on New Year's Eve. The courts were because it was a Friday. So I take the kids to court. I have no idea how to get a restraining order, but I just thought, well, we'll figure this out. And I figured it out, and I go before the judge, and I have the kids sitting in the back of the courtroom. And I just remember thinking, I'm trying to turn around and reassure them, this is okay. And then I thought, you're crazy. You're trying to normalize some absurd thing here for your children and your family. This is making no sense. So those were kind of the three things that really helped me have a little more insight into, you got to do something about this.
Yeah. You had said in that there was times where your husband said, okay, I'm not going to drink anymore. Did that come from you confronting him? What did that look like for him? I mean, he obviously is starting to potentially recognize, hey, this is abnormal. What did those moments of clarity either for him look like, or what did it look like for you to confront him about that?
Well, confronting is a very nice word. I'd probably say threaten was more of what I did. I was angry with him, as you can imagine. I was really angry with him. So when I would confront him about his drinking initially, I think early on, it starts out like everybody, right? I think you have a problem. No, I don't. And then you start to question your own sanity. Yeah, maybe there was more in the bottle. Maybe I'm exaggerating or not noticing how much, is gone. And, you start to question that gaslighting. You start to think you're the one nuts who's nuts. And, but eventually, I kept talking with him about, I think you have some depression, I think you have some anxiety. And initially he was willing to go to counseling. And so we would go, I'll go with you. We would go together, and there was always a problem with the counselor. And I think the moment the counselor got close, talking about the root of his drinking and the reason he drank, I think then he just, that counselor's no good, and he wouldn't go back to that person. That was a stupid counselor. They don't know what they're talking about. And I remember in your story, you talk about that South Beach moment where your wife says, I don't want you to promise to stop drinking. I want you to find the root cause of why you're drinking. Yep. And he didn't want to do that deep down. So continue to go to counseling. Eventually, my request to have him stop drinking turned into more demands and trying to negotiate and all of that bargaining, and then just a kind of threats. You can't stay here if you're going to drink. I'm going to kick you out, which I did multiple times. But it was towards the end, those interactions were pretty negative. I reacted a lot to his drinking.
So with that in mind, and I hope this isn't a loaded question, but I maybe pick up a little bit on this, is that, because I'm sure, there's wives or there's husbands listening to this, and, they're really resonating with what you just said, right? I don't, I have a family member who's would really resonate with what you said. Would you do anything differently? Do you think now that you're on this side of it, is there a different way? Is there a better way? Is there anything you would do differently in how you talk to him about it?
Absolutely. There are many things I would have done differently. And of course, hindsight's 20/20, but I learned a lot of lessons in all of that. I think the first thing I would have done differently is trusted my instincts. I'm a physician. I understand the science of the disease. I understand the diagnosis. I understand the co-occurrence of mental health and, mental health illnesses such as depression, anxiety, PTSD with addiction. I get all that. The wife side of me was struggling with all of that anger. And anger was my predominant emotion. in my mind, we had the perfect life. Now, it wasn't perfect by no means. We lived in a small 2-bedroom house, but we had a great piece of property, wonderful trees. It was a gorgeous piece of property. He's a remodeler builder. He's going to remodel and add an addition to our house, so we're going to make it our own. We have a beautiful daughter, a wonderful son. Our kids are healthy. We're healthy. My career's on the upswing. Really, what more could we want? In my mind, we had it all. And so I was angry that he was willing to throw all of that away and to pick a bottle over this, what I thought was the most beautiful life possible. And I think if I could go back, I think learning to look at it more objectively, and it's so hard when you're in that role, right?
Yeah.
All I saw was the subjective part of that. And one of the counselor that I had gone to had told me, respond, don't react. Now, that's really easy on paper. It's really difficult to do. But the physician part of me could certainly respond, but the wife part of me just reacted. And I think if I had stepped back, saw it for what it was, not let him convince me that this really wasn't a big deal or that he's drinking because it's my fault, because I'm not doing this or I'm doing that. There was always a reason he was drinking, and it usually was something I did or wasn't doing. And if I learned to, and then I'm trying to chase that unnecessarily. I'll fix what I'm doing so he stops drinking. That's not why he's really drinking. So I think that would have saved me a lot of anguish, first of all. I think recognizing that no matter what I did, I was taught in med school and residency, you work hard, you don't complain, you compartmentalize, you have emotional resilience, you get through these things. And I applied those same strategies to this marriage. It doesn't work. I can't work harder at his sobriety than he is.
Yeah.
And I think learning and trusting in God, and there's a whole faith part to this.
Yeah, I can't wait to get into.
Yeah, I wish some of those faith lessons I learned earlier in the course. I learned them a little bit later, but that would have also saved me a lot of anguish. I'm, looking back at his disease, his trauma and depression, anxiety were so bad. I don't honestly know what I could have said that could have convinced him to get the help. I don't know if there's anything I could have said. He was very resistant to dealing with that discomfort and vulnerability that comes with figuring out that root cause.
Yes.
And, I wish I had done more to keep my children protected from it. But I don't know that I could have impacted his disease, which I think is a critical thing for listeners, because I'm a doctor. I take care of people who have addiction. In family medicine, I take care of folks who battle alcohol and drugs quite often. I couldn't fix or solve my husband's problem. I couldn't cure that for him. And I think that's really an important part for these other folks to realize, if a doctor can't do it, nobody can. It has to come from the person with the addiction.
So you talked about protecting your kids, and I know that's something that my wife has talked about, right? Because I think there's people who have asked her, hey, why maybe didn't you do X, Y, and Z? And, I think as she has explained it, she's like, listen, I became so focused on the kids, making sure that they had, a normal, quote unquote life. So when you talk about, thinking back, like what would that even have looked like? Because I think there are some people who are like, okay, maybe I'm listening to this and I know I have to let him or her crash and burn. Like, to your point, maybe they have recognized I can't fix them. They're going to have to come to the end of themselves. And they're in a mode of, now I need to at least minimize the damage. What does it look like to protect the rest of your family from some of that?
That's a really good question.
We'll be right back after this.
That's a really good question. And I think the answer to that is going to depend on the age of the child, right? So, if you have for the baby toddler age, a child who truly needs to be watched all the time, you can't leave that child with someone with an addiction who's under the influence, because there's no way to guarantee they're going to be able to keep that baby or toddler safe. So, I think that looks different at that age. I think once you get into childhood where kids are, a little more self-sufficient, and that grade school and high school era, I think that protecting them looks a little different. And then even as adult children, I think that looks also very different. And I can tell you what I did in the stages and what I wish I had done differently, and that may help explain. Yeah. But the baby toddler thing, I was constantly watching them. He never drank outside the home initially. And as his disease progressed, he would start to drink when we'd be out for dinner or out somewhere. He never drove when he was drinking before, never. But as his disease escalated, much like all addiction, he was willing to take more risks in order to have that substance and self-medicate. He began to drink and drive at those times. Now, I never hesitated to take the keys away, hide the keys, call the cops. I did that once when I knew he had left and was driving intoxicated, and they did not find him, unfortunately, but he also did not hit anybody, fortunately. So at least everybody was safe there. But the kids and I, once they got into grade school, they knew that he was drinking, and they knew what that all meant. And they also knew, I had multiple conversations with them about, you never get in the car with daddy when he's drinking. And even to this day, when my kids started to drive, I'm like, when are drunks most likely to be on the road? And their answer to that is anytime. And I'm like, exactly, because they can be driving at any time.
Yeah.
So, the kids I had walked them through a plan that if daddy's making you get in the car and he's been drinking, this is what you do, how to avoid doing that. Daycare was another situation because I was nervous he would drink and pick them up. I found out later what would happen is when he wasn't working, he would drink in the afternoon, go pick them up as if he was getting off work at that time, but he'd be driving there drinking and then bring them home. So I talked with the daycare owner and said, you can't let him take them. That was a problem because she said, legally, I can't prevent a parent from picking up their own child. And I said, well, if he looks to be under the influence, then you have to call me immediately. Please do not let him ever take those children. As his disease got even worse, he threatened to take the kids and not, just basically kidnap them and go. And I was terrified about that. And I had needed a plan for that. My kids weren't old enough to drive at the time. So we had a neighbor a couple doors down. And this is one of there's certain people throughout this journey that really stand out as having been remarkably kind and understanding. And she was one of them. There's many people like that. But this is a neighbor that I knew in passing, talking about plants and flowers and watching her dog occasionally. And I had called her and I was crying. I was on my way to work and I said, which was the norm, crying on my way to work almost all the time. But I called her and I said, if my kids need a safe place to go, can they please come hide in your garage? Because they always left their service door open for their dog. They had a dog entrance thing. And I said, can they go through that and hide in your garage? She didn't ask me any questions. She had no idea what was going on in our home. She didn't really know me all that well, but her answer was, yes, of course. And if I'm home, I will take them in my home and I will keep them until you can come in. And just knowing that my kids had a safe haven and a plan is an unbelievably important thing to a mom who's trying to protect her kids. My challenge was I worked 45 minutes away from our home, so for me to get back quickly was a bit of an issue. But I think having conversations, age-appropriate conversations with them as well, you know, safety first was the biggest thing, but talking with them from an emotional perspective, you know, making sure that they understood Daddy loves you. But he has a disease that makes it difficult for it to show all the time. You know, but I think that's really important for kids to know your parents do love you, right? And my son, when he was 9, I remember him looking at me and he just said, if Daddy loves us so much, why does he drink so much? And I tried to explain that. And then at some point I just looked at him and I said, look, buddy, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know how to explain that to you. I wonder the same thing, but I do know he does love us. And it was an honest answer. And he said, okay. And he got down and went and played with Legos again, you know. But checking in with them regularly, I think, is important. Debriefing after certain things is really important. You know, we had a lot of arguments in front of the kids, and I would have changed that. I think that was difficult for them to hear and witness all the time, parents always fighting. But some of those things are easier said and after the fact, right?
Yeah, and I think, you know, my next question, and maybe you've kind of answered it a little bit, but you know, how do you thread the needle between, you know, when you have a loved one, and especially when kids are involved, which I think a lot of times they are, right? Of making sure that you're not raising the kids to resent their parent, but also not, you know, letting that spouse who's engaging in this activity know and sometimes maybe even feel, hey, there are consequences for what you're doing. You know, you're driving a wedge between you and your kids, or you're driving a wedge between me and you, or you're driving, like, how do you thread that needle as the, you know, sober parent, of not turning your kids against the other spouse, but then not shielding the spouse from some of the consequences of their actions?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was a real challenge, you know, because initially I tried to protect him so that the kids didn't realize he had this problem, right? So in the morning, I'm cleaning up the mess, right? I'm fixing it all up so the kids don't see this and he's not embarrassed in front of them, which is enabling, right? He's not having the consequences of his actions. But at that point, trying to balance what the kids think of their dad and him having the consequences of his disease, you know, I still had hope he would recover. So to me, it was more important at that stage to protect him and not let the kids see that, right? As his disease progressed, it was impossible to protect him. But he also wasn't working. He was staying home more. And what ended up happening was, instead of them resenting him, I think there were a lot of things that happened that made the kids see him as the hero and see me as the bad guy, because I had to be the adult and I had to be the parent in our home. Right. So I'm the one, you know, I can remember saying to the kids, you know, okay, we're done with dinner. Why don't you clean up and get dishes done? And again, disease talking, not the man. But why are you making them always do dishes? You're just so lazy. You don't do anything around here. You should be doing these dishes. Kids, you go play. Okay, so now what do I do with that, right? You know, kids, we got to sit down and do homework. Oh, the teachers are stupid. They don't have to do any of that homework. They don't even know what they're teaching them. Now I'm fighting to do homework. So I was the bad guy, I think, through a lot of that. And I think there was the wedge really got driven between me and the kids, is how I feel. I pray my kids don't feel like that. But tiptoeing around correcting what he was saying without escalating his behavior in the moment was really tricky for me.
Yeah.
And that balance and that started to shift where it was just getting untenable. And that's when I would start kicking him out. You know, we can't do this. We can't keep doing this.
Right. There was one other thing you said that I wanted to go back to. You know, you had talked about the fact that he had this unresolved trauma, the PTSD, the anxiety, the depression, which is part of my story as well. You know, do you think that if he would have gotten to that route, if he would have addressed that, do you think this would have ended differently?
I think there's a really good chance of that. You know, you can't keep going for the quick fix, the easy solution. You know, that PTSD and trauma led to a lot of discomfort, a lot of pain. And another turning point for him was the Sandy Hook school shooting. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
A long time ago in December. Our church had a ministry. It was a comfort dog ministry. And basically these are these golden retrievers who are trained to be comfort dogs. And in times of great trauma like that school shooting, the dogs would go in with handlers who were trained to bring them into these situations. And people who struggled, who were in pain and acute trauma from whatever just happened, who couldn't verbalize or articulate, they could sit down and pet a dog.
Yeah.
Right. And the dog would just lay there, put their head on their lap, and they could be comforted by a comfort dog. It was much less threatening in some ways than talking with another person about what just happened. So he was trained as one of these handlers, and he and two ladies from our church took the dog out there, and he went twice, once in December and then once in January. And I think that trauma of going out there to help those kids and seeing what those kids were going through, I think that resurrected and just multiplied his own trauma from before. After that, his drinking dramatically escalated. And I think he just was not able to sit with that discomfort and that vulnerability long enough to actually work on a long-term solution. It was just the quick fix. That pain needed to go away, and it needed to go away now.
Yep.
I think if he had gotten to that root cause, it may have changed the outcome, but I think that's the only way, the only possibility that could have possibly changed the outcome.
So you said something there that I think is a great segue, that I said I wanted to get to, but you talked about being involved at your church and whatnot. I'm curious, what was his, and maybe yours at the time, but what was his relationship with Jesus like throughout this?
Intermittent. You know, it was sometimes good, sometimes bad. When we first started dating, and once we got married, you know, church was my faith, and church life had always been a part of my life. For me, there was a little stint in the 20s where I got a little mad at God, but I came back and was faithful about going to church and being involved, Bible studies and things for me. So he started going with me, and we went religiously every Sunday. He was involved in this ministry. I taught Awanas for the kids and led adult Bible studies. And he was part of a early response team our church had as well. This was a ministry that when there's tornadoes or other natural disasters or hurricanes, they'll go out and they'll do some, you know, heavy duty chainsawing and tree cleanup and debris cleanup, just all in the name of Jesus. And he was part of that. Someone at church made him mad one time. He didn't like something someone said to him, so he refused to go back and said we had to find another church. So we started church shopping, but he wouldn't go with us because he was just mad at church. But once I found a church that would work, he'd be willing to try it out. And I thought, why am I doing the church shopping? If he's the one that wants to change the churches, then he needs to go find where he wants to go. But I think, again, that was just an excuse. I think someone at church got a little too close and identified that he had a problem, and I think it was his way of avoiding it. So he would occasionally go. I don't know what his relationship was like with Jesus when he passed. I really don't know where he was with his faith. And that's a little uncomfortable for me, because I just don't know.
Yeah. You had kind of alluded to this, but one of the questions that I had too was, and something you said there kind of popped that back into my mind, which is, did you guys have friends either at church or otherwise who were picking up on how much of a problem this was becoming, or was everyone else kind of aloof to it?
I think some people did. I ended up losing all of my girlfriends because I was in survival mode. I had no time. And I was managing the entire house, working full time. And any free time I had, I wanted to be with my kids because I felt like my opportunity to be a mom with my little ones was being taken away. So any moment I had, I wanted to be mom. So I didn't have much time left over, but when you don't maintain a friendship, it kind of falls apart, and that's all on me. And that was my fault. But we had a group of friends from like daycare and the kids' sports and things that we would occasionally do things with. It started to get too difficult to go to those because I would never know what the outcome was going to be. I was always on pins and needles. Is he going to drink too much and get angry and say something that's going to embarrass me and make it awkward for everybody? Or is it going to go okay and he's just going to come home and drink? Most of the time, he would just come home and he would drink there, but not enough to be passing out. But once we got home, then he would really drink more. That Halloween party that I referenced, one of the neighbors called me the next day and she says, he had quite a bit to drink. Did he even make it home last night? So I think people were starting to notice and starting to suspect. It was very difficult for a lot of the people that I did confide in. I felt embarrassed and ashamed and like I was a failure because of all this. So there weren't many people that I told what was going on. A lot of the people who are very close to us that I confided in, I don't think could believe it. And I think unless you live in that house and see how much he's drinking, because he would come behind me and say, I'm exaggerating or I'm the problem. And I think all in a way to cover up how much he was drinking. And, he was a very affable guy, very convincing. And I think he just kind of said, I don't drink that much, she's exaggerating. And so I think people assumed I was just being a little too picky. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely does. Right. And I think it's one of the things that addiction is isolating, not just for the person engaging in it. It's also isolating, for those around that person. Right. And whether intentionally or not, I think, we as the addict like it better that way. Right. If I'm on an island, great. And then if you're on an island, great as well, because then you can't, draw attention to me or whatnot. So it makes absolute sense.
Just one thing to follow up with that, we have, there are way more recovering addicts and currently addicted people, I think, than most of the public realize.
Yes.
And, we have some recovered alcoholics in our church. They saw through it. they could tell what was going on. I think they identified it immediately, and they knew. They would say things to me. One of them said, he's got a God-sized hole in his heart, doesn't he? And then a couple weeks later, he's like, I can smell it on his breath this morning. So there were the people who knew how to identify the signs. They knew it right away.
Do you think, and this is not I'm not asking you to talk bad about anyone or anything. I'm genuinely curious. Is there anything that you think or wish those people could or would have done differently?
No, actually, they did more than I expected to try to help. Our church has a phenomenal group of people. My church family is absolutely amazing. They did not hesitate to help. So one of the gentlemen, I would just call him and say, "Can you give me any advice on what I could do right now?" When we did an intervention, two of the people from church that he was close with, I called them and said, "This is really bad. Can you come over today at 3:00? We'll be there." So they didn't hesitate to show up and help in any way I asked them to. They tried to. They tried to talk with him, and they visited him. When he was in the hospital, they did what our pastor went to see him when he was in the hospital. I think people did what they could. So I was grateful for all of their help. I don't think I could have asked anything more of them.
We'll be right back after this.
Well, listen, that feels like a good place to pause and kind of put a bow on part one. I was literally just talking to someone this week who has a friend, and they are trying to figure out what to do because the spouse just will not admit their issue with addiction. And it is really hard. And so I think kind of that part where Brenda is talking about not being able to want sobriety at a minimum for someone more than they want it themselves. And I know if you're listening to this, that can feel so helpless. I get it. And I wish I could tell you the magic thing to do. Now, next week, we're going to hear some of the things that Brenda did, and what she learned, the ways in which maybe they were helpful, the ways in which they were not. But there is not a just, hey, here's the decision tree outlined for you, and here's what you can do. There are resources. I would recommend to start. My friend Caroline Beidler has written a book called When You Love Someone in Recovery, and I think there are some great pieces of advice in that book. But if you are that spouse, please reach out to me. You can go to veritasrecovery.org, and shoot a message. And there are some resources too that we can tailor, kind of based on your situation and whatnot. So please reach out. Now, next week we will get the conclusion of the story. There is some incredible things in there, and then we'll kind of go towards wrapping it up with where Brenda has landed today and how she's encouraging others as well. So you will not want to miss that. If there is something in this podcast, in this episode so far, that has been helpful to you, please share it with someone. Not even asking you to like, subscribe, whatever. But share it. Share it with someone who can be encouraged. And then go to veritasrecovery.org and let me know your story as well. Love you all. We'll see you back here next week for part 2 with Brenda Fann Katula.